The Roman Empire is still considered the cradle of Western civilization, yet many ideas we hold about it stem more from idealized myths than from verified historical facts. Many people automatically associate it with invincible legions, marble temples, and emperors obsessed with power, without reflecting on how much these images actually correspond to historical reality. Films, novels, and even textbooks have for decades presented us with a simplified, sometimes outright mythical, image of the empire, one that was often more a product of modern imagination than the result of careful scholarly research. In this video, we will focus on the most widespread misconceptions that have long shaped our view of the everyday life of ordinary Romans, as well as the functioning of their complex empire. The myth of the vomitorium as a room where ancient Romans relieved the contents of their stomachs during banquets is deeply rooted, yet historically inaccurate. In reality, the term vomitorium referred to an architectural feature in Roman amphitheaters and theaters. The Latin term vomitorium comes from the verb vomere, meaning to spew forth or to expel. In an architectural context, it described corridors or passageways in amphitheaters and theaters that allowed spectators to reach their seats quickly and exit efficiently after performances. For example, the Colosseum in Rome had 76 such passageways, enabling up to 50,000 spectators to reach their seats within about 15 minutes. The idea that a vomitorium was a room intended for inducing vomiting during feasts only appeared in modern times. This mistaken interpretation likely arose in the 20th century, when some authors incorrectly connected the etymology of the word with Roman dining habits. In 1961, for instance, Lewis Mumford defined a vomitorium in his book The City in History as a room for vomiting, which helped spread this misconception. Although there are literary references to overeating among the Roman elite, there is no evidence that Romans deliberately induced vomiting during banquets. The philosopher Seneca the Younger, in his work Consolatio ad Helvium, criticizes the luxurious lifestyle of certain Romans and mentions that they vomit in order to eat, and eat in order to vomit. However, this passage serves more as a moral condemnation of excessive consumption than as a description of common practice. Julius Caesar is one of the most iconic figures in Roman history, and his violent death in 44 BCE entered history not only as a political turning point but also as a moment shrouded in legend, especially regarding his supposed last words. The most famous version comes from William Shakespeare, Et tu, Brute. These words have become a symbol of betrayal and the dramatic end of a powerful man. Historical reality, however, is more complex and far less certain. This specific phrase does not appear in ancient sources. Shakespeare invented it for dramatic effect, to heighten the tragedy of a betrayed leader. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, who wrote about 150 years after Caesar's death, there was a belief that Caesar, at the moment of the attack, supposedly addressed his murderer and protege Brutus in Greek with the words kai sai, teknon, translated as you too, child, or you too, my son. Suetonius adds, however, that most witnesses claimed Caesar merely groaned after the first stab and said nothing at all. The phrase kai sai, teknon is ambiguous. It could have been an expression of shock, reproach, or even prophecy. Interpretations vary. One hypothesis suggests that Caesar was expressing deep disappointment at Brutus's betrayal. Another proposes that it was a prophetic statement, implying that Brutus himself would soon meet a violent death, which ultimately happened. The term teknon, child, suggests a personal, almost paternal relationship, since Brutus was the son of Caesar's mistress Servilia, and it was rumored that he might even have been Caesar's illegitimate son. The use of Greek itself was not unusual. In the late Roman Republic, Greek was a common language among the educated elite, and Caesar was bilingual, fluent in both Latin and Greek. Greek was widely used in literature, philosophy, and diplomacy, and it was not uncommon for it to appear in personal conversations or written works. The myth that ancient Roman statues were originally white is commonly accepted as fact, but the opposite is true. In reality, These statues were often painted in vivid colors that faded or disappeared over time, leading to the mistaken belief about their original appearance. Archaeological discoveries and modern technologies, such as ultraviolet fluorescence and pigment analysis, have revealed traces of color on many ancient statues. For example, the famous statue of Augustus of Prima Porta was originally decorated with colors depicting bronze-toned skin, brown hair, and a red garment. These findings confirm that color was a common element of ancient sculpture. The idea of white classical statues emerged during the Renaissance, when statues were rediscovered with their paint largely worn away. Renaissance artists and thinkers, such as Johann Joachim Winckelmann, idealized white marble as a symbol of purity and aesthetic perfection, which led to the neglect of the sculpture's original polychromy. Today, scholars and museum curators attempt to reconstruct the original appearance of ancient statues through exhibitions such as Gods in Color, which presents replicas of statues painted in their original hues. These exhibitions help the public better understand what ancient statues actually looked like and how they were perceived at the time of their creation. In ancient Rome, gladiators were not exclusively men. There were also female gladiators, known as gladiatrices. Although they were rare, their participation in the arenas is documented by historical sources, literary references, and archaeological finds. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence is a relief from Halicarnassus depicting two women named Amazon and Achillea fighting in the arena. The inscription states that their match ended in a draw, suggesting they were regarded as equal opponents. This relief is housed in the British Museum and represents a rare visual testimony to female gladiators. Another source is the Sixth Satire by the Roman poet Juvenal, who criticizes upper-class women who took part in gladiatorial games. He mentions, for example, Epia, the wife of a senator, who abandoned her family and ran off to Egypt with a gladiator. Women's participation in the arena was controversial in Roman society. In 22 BCE, a law was passed forbidding women of higher social classes from participating in public performances, including gladiatorial games. Later, around 200 CE, Emperor Septimius Severus banned all women from appearing in the arenas, regardless of social status. This prohibition was a reaction to the growing number of women in the arena and concerns over public morality. The myth that Emperor Nero played the lyre while Rome burned is one of the most famous but historically unsupported stories about ancient Rome. This image emerged only in later periods and is not corroborated by contemporary sources. The Great Fire of Rome broke out on July 19, 64 CE, in the area of merchant stalls near the Circus Maximus. The fire lasted 6 days, was briefly extinguished, and then reignited, continuing for another 3 days. In total, about 10 of the city's 14 districts were destroyed. According to the historian Tacitus, Nero was not in Rome when the fire began but was instead in Antium. Upon returning to the city, he organized relief efforts for the affected population, opened his palaces to the homeless, and ensured food supplies. The fire and its aftermath were later exploited for political purposes. Nero blamed Christians for starting the fire, which led to their persecution. Historians such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio, who wrote decades after the events, often portrayed Nero in a negative light, contributing to the spread of the myth about his indifference during the fire. The idea that the Roman Empire definitively ended in 476 CE is an oversimplified view of a complex historical process. This year is traditionally marked as the end of the Western Roman Empire, when the Germanic warlord Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus. However, the actual decline of Roman power and culture was gradual and multifaceted and cannot be confined to a single year or event. In 395 CE, the Roman Empire was divided into Western and Eastern halves. The Western Roman Empire, with its center in Ravenna, faced increasing internal problems and external threats in the 5th century. In 476 CE, Odoacer, leader of Germanic mercenaries, deposed Romulus Augustulus and became ruler of Italy. This event is often labeled as the end of the Western Roman Empire, even though many Roman institutions and traditions continued under Odoacer's rule. The Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, survived the fall of the western part and lasted until 1453. Its inhabitants continued to call themselves Romans and regarded their state as the direct continuation of the Roman Empire. Byzantium preserved many Roman institutions and legal systems, even as it gradually adapted to new cultural and religious influences. The true end of Roman civilization was thus the result of long-term processes rather than a single event. The notion that Romans commonly wore togas is another widespread myth. In reality, the toga was a formal garment worn only by male Roman citizens on special occasions, such as public ceremonies, religious rituals, or court proceedings. It was impractical for everyday wear due to its size, the complexity of putting it on, and the restricted mobility it caused. The satirist Juvenal noted in his third satire that in many parts of Italy no one puts on a toga unless he is dead, suggesting that even at ceremonial occasions outside Rome, the toga was rare. The common garment for both men and women was the tunic, a simple, comfortable, and practical piece of clothing suitable for daily activities. The toga symbolized Roman citizenship and social status. Different types of togas denoted different roles and ranks. For example, the toga praetexta with a purple border was reserved for magistrates and boys of noble birth, while the dark woolen toga pulla was worn during mourning. Over time, the toga became so impractical that ordinary citizens stopped wearing it altogether. It remained part of the attire of senators and high officials at official events, though even there its popularity declined. Emperor Hadrian even ordered senators and equestrians to wear the toga in public in an attempt to preserve traditional Roman values. The belief that early Christian martyrs were mass executed in the Colosseum is deeply ingrained in popular imagination, yet historical evidence does not support it. Persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire began as early as the 1st century CE, with the first known persecution occurring under Emperor Nero after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Christians were accused of atheism, refusal to worship the emperor, and secret gatherings, which led to their punishment as criminals. The Colosseum, also known as the Flavian Amphitheater, was completed in 80 CE, after the earliest persecutions of Christians. Although traditions link the Colosseum with martyrdom, concrete historical evidence of mass executions of Christians there is lacking. Some later sources mention individual cases, such as the martyrs Abdon and Senon, but these accounts are limited and often originate from much later periods. Evidence suggests that Christians were more commonly executed at other locations in Rome, such as the Circus Maximus or the Circus of Nero. According to the historian Tacitus, after the fire of 64 CE, Christians were executed in Nero's gardens and circus, where they were burned alive or thrown to wild animals. The association of the Colosseum with large-scale Christian martyrdom began to take shape only in the Middle Ages. In 1749, Pope Benedict XIV declared the Colosseum a sacred site, supposedly consecrated by the blood of martyrs, and banned its use for secular purposes. This decision was largely symbolic and not based on concrete historical evidence. The myth that gladiatorial matches in ancient Rome always ended with the death of one of the fighters is widespread, largely due to films and literature. In reality, most of these combats were less deadly than modern portrayals suggest. Historian Garrett Ryan, in his book Naked Statues, Fat Gladiators, and War Elephants, states that gladiators died in roughly 1/5 of matches. Other scholars, based on epigraphic and literary sources, estimate mortality rates of around 10 to 20% per match. For example, a study by Georges Ville, based on gladiator tombstones from the 1st century, indicates that 19 out of 100 gladiators died in combat, corresponding to a mortality rate of about 9.5% per match. Gladiators represented a significant investment for their owners, known as lanisti. Their training, housing, and medical care were expensive, and it was therefore in the owner's interest to keep them alive as long as possible. Losing an experienced gladiator meant not only a financial loss but also damage to reputation and future earnings. Matches were governed by strict rules and overseen by referees, who could stop a fight or grant mercy to a defeated gladiator. Missio, the granting of mercy, was often awarded to fighters who showed courage and skill, even in defeat. This practice reduced mortality while also increasing the dramatic appeal of the games and audience engagement. Although gladiatorial contests were dangerous and often bloody, most did not end in the death of one of the combatants. Economic interests, regulations, and the possibility of mercy all played key roles in keeping gladiators alive. The myth that Roman women had no influence on public life does not correspond to historical reality. Although ancient Rome was a patriarchal society, women played active roles in economic, social, and sometimes even political life. Roman women did not have the right to vote and could not hold public office, but they did possess certain legal rights. They could own property, enter into contracts, and conduct legal proceedings. Roman law recognized the status of sui juris, which referred to individuals who were legally independent and capable of managing their own property and carrying out legal acts on their own behalf. Women with this status enjoyed some of the same rights as men. During the period of the Principate, the legal position of women gradually improved. For example, the law known as ius liberorum, introduced under Emperor Augustus, exempted women who had given birth to 3 or more children from the obligation to have a legal guardian, granting them greater legal autonomy. An example of an economically active woman is Julia Felix, who owned extensive property in Pompeii. After the earthquake of 62 CE, she transformed her house into a complex with public baths, shops, and rental apartments. Although women did not hold formal political power, some exerted considerable influence through their family connections. For instance, Livia Drusilla, the wife of Emperor Augustus, and Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Emperor Nero, played significant roles in the political life of their time. Their positions enabled them to influence decision-making at the highest levels. A notable example of women's public engagement occurred in 195 BCE, when Roman women protested against the Lex Oppia. This law, passed during the Second Punic War, restricted women from wearing luxurious clothing and jewelry. After the war ended, women demanded its repeal and gathered en masse in the streets of Rome to express their opposition. Their persistence ultimately led to the law being abolished. The idea that all inhabitants of the Roman Empire looked the same and spoke Latin does not reflect reality. At the height of its power in the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire stretched from present-day England to Turkey and encompassed a wide range of peoples, cultures, and languages, including Aramaic, Greek, and Gaulish. The Roman Empire was a multicultural state in which different languages and customs coexisted. The eastern provinces, such as Syria and Egypt, commonly used Aramaic and Greek, while Celtic languages were spoken in Gaul and Britain. Latin was the language of administration and the army, but local languages predominated in everyday life. In 1901, the remains of a woman known as the Ivory Bangle Lady were discovered in York. Analysis of her bones and isotopes suggests that she was of African origin and grew up in a warmer climate, most likely North Africa. She was buried with luxury items, including ivory jewelry and glass vessels, indicating her high social status. This discovery demonstrates the presence of people of African origin in Roman Britain and their integration into local society. Hadrian's Wall, built in northern England as a defensive frontier, was manned by soldiers from various parts of the empire, including North Africa. Archaeological finds and inscriptions confirm the presence of units from Mauritania, in present-day Morocco and Algeria, known as the numerous Aurelianora Mororum. These units were stationed in forts along the wall and took part in its defense. Some Roman emperors themselves came from provinces outside Italy. Emperor Trajan was born in Hispania, in present-day Spain, and was the first emperor of non-Italian origin. Emperor Septimius Severus was born in Leptis Magna, in present-day Libya, and was the first emperor of African origin. His reign was marked by military campaigns and reforms, and his background reflected the diversity of the Roman Empire. The myth that the Romans salted the soil of Carthage after conquering it in 146 BCE to prevent future settlement is widespread, but it is a superstition rather than a historical fact. This idea emerged only in the 19th century and is not supported by any ancient sources. During the Third Punic War, Roman forces led by Scipio Aemilianus captured Carthage after a prolonged siege. The city was systematically burned and destroyed, and its population was massacred or sold into slavery, with approximately 50,000 survivors enslaved. After the conquest, the city was razed to the ground and the land was plowed, symbolizing its complete erasure from the map. However, no ancient author, including Appian, Pliny the Elder, or Polybius, mentions the salting of the soil. The idea of salting Carthage likely originated from the biblical story of the destruction of the city of Shechem, where, according to the Book of Judges, Abimelech sowed the city with salt. This act symbolized a curse and the prevention of future settlement. In the 19th century, this motif was mistakenly associated with Carthage, particularly through references in works such as the New American Cyclopedia, 1858, and later the Cambridge Ancient History, 1930. Salting the soil would have been not only symbolic but also impractical. Salt was a valuable commodity in antiquity, and its large-scale use would have been economically inefficient. Moreover, the Romans had a strong interest in exploiting the fertile North African land for agriculture. As early as 121 BCE, Gaius Gracchus attempted to found a Roman colony on the site of Carthage, and during the reign of Emperor Augustus, the city was rebuilt as an important center of the province of Africa. The image of ancient Rome as a place of constant orgies and sexual excess is deeply rooted in modern culture, largely thanks to films, television series, and exaggerated historical narratives. From a historical perspective, however, this image is highly distorted and unsupported. Direct evidence of so-called orgies, in the sense of mass sexual gatherings of the Roman aristocracy, is rare. There are references to unrestrained behavior by certain emperors, but these stories are often preserved through chroniclers whose aim was to tarnish their reputations. Moreover, it is not always clear what constitutes historical fact and what is political satire or moral criticism. In reality, Roman society was relatively conservative, especially during the Republican period. For example, public displays of affection, even between spouses, were considered inappropriate. A historical anecdote describes a senator who was expelled from office for kissing his wife in front of his daughter. This does not mean, however, that Romans were Puritans. Marriages among the Roman aristocracy were often accompanied by infidelity, particularly on the part of men, who commonly maintained sexual relationships with their slaves. Nevertheless, Roman society placed great emphasis on public order, prestige, and morality, at least outwardly. Sex was a normal part of life, but not in the form of mass, decadent celebrations as often portrayed in films. Moreover, a significant portion of the myths about a decadent Rome originated in the early Christian and medieval periods, when Christian authors deliberately depicted the pagan past as morally corrupt in order to justify the cultural and religious shift toward Christianity. The Colosseum, one of the most iconic symbols of ancient Rome, is known by this name worldwide. Even we have used this designation several times in this video for the sake of simplicity. Few people realize, however, that the original name of this monumental structure was Amphitheatrum Flavium, or the Flavian Amphitheater. This name referred to the Flavian dynasty, specifically Emperor Vespasian, who initiated its construction, and his son Titus, who completed it in 80 CE. The modern name Colosseum began to be used only in the Middle Ages, probably from the 8th century onward. It was derived from the gigantic statue of Emperor Nero known as the Colossus of Nero, Colossus Neronis, which stood nearby. This statue was later remodeled into the likeness of the sun god and became a prominent landmark in Rome. Over time, the name Colosseum came to refer to the amphitheater itself, while the original name fell into disuse. Construction of the Colosseum began around 72 CE and was completed in 80 CE. The amphitheater served as a venue for gladiatorial contests, public executions, and other forms of entertainment for the Roman population. Its capacity reached up to 50,000 spectators, making it the largest amphitheater ever built in the Roman Empire. Over the centuries, the Colosseum suffered damage from earthquakes and was used for various purposes, including housing, workshops, and even as a fortress. Despite these changes, the Colosseum remains one of the most significant symbols of ancient Rome and is listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And that is all from us regarding the myths that are commonly associated with the Romans. Which one surprised you the most? Which did you find the most interesting? Can you think of any others? Let us know in the comments.